Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Gaming Tech.com video, we're going to be discussing, as well as analysing, tech news, which as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully you're having an amazing day. We have a ridiculous amount of cool stuff to get through in today's video. Apologies for me not being on camera for today. Quite honestly, I'm trying to finish a review for AMD and also a couple of projects as well for a couple of other different companies. So things are all just completely crazy and well, yeah, I just didn't get to charge the camera, long story short. But anyway, getting back to today's video, by golly gosh, there is a lot of stuff for the second generation of RDNA and also RDNA 3. According to a very well-known leaker, Aquarius Z. Now, I want to stress that this individual, you can do a Google of their history on ptt.cc. They've been very accurate previously for a lot of AMD stuff and other things in the industry as well. So they have stated, and by the way, thanks to Lafrite David, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, on Twitter for the discovery of this particular thread, that there are no orders at the moment for the second generation of Navi. Earliest November. This marries up very nicely with previous leaks, that right now AMD will be behind Nvidia in the launch, at least unless something changes with Nvidia holding back their supposedly September launch window. It does seem like Nvidia will be on store shelves first, which I don't know if that's necessarily a good or a bad thing. It may mean that AMD therefore can do a debated again and perhaps undercut Nvidia, or AMD can choose to maybe, let's say, put out a last-minute BIOS update, which would increase the clock frequency of RAM or whatever. We don't know what, obviously, all of the specs for the different SKUs will be, but I don't believe at the moment a lot of the specs that have leaked for the lower-end SKUs, especially for RDNA 2, were accurate. There is also no 2.5D memory, so no HBM2 for RDNA second generation. There's also the big sister and little sister, which I assume means the higher end SKU and the slightly lower end SKU. And this will use a different node, but this is the imperative thing. This is, to me, the really important part. They are now internally examining third generation Navi, and they're apparently very busy with it, and it's a different layout. It's the biggest revolution of GPUs ever. And they've also stated that the key word for this is Zen 2. Boy, I'm not going to spend too much on RDNA 2 here because, honestly, a lot of it is just echoing things we already knew. Instead, I want to focus on RDNA 3 because it's like the thing that I want to cuddle and, like, you know, just never let go of. Because I think there's several things that we can take away from this. The first is that this matches up perfectly with several of my previous leaks. AMD have been internally testing RDNA 3 for a long time. This is why, when I stated that RDNA features are part of the PS5, I was very confident. I am pretty damn sure that the PS5 does have things like improved geometry handling, which is going to be part of the later AMD roadmap. And there are some other things as well that I've been asked to not mention because people are quite uncomfortable with me mentioning certain things. But I've gone into this extensively in the past. Basically, the bring up of chips is not 6 months to the last minute. AMD work on multiple projects at once, and basically the bring up of a chip exists in different stages. It exists in, obviously, initial concept and design stages. Then you have pre-silicon, and then obviously they're starting to work on the engineering samples, and then finally, obviously, the chip releases. And yes, I am missing quite a few stages there, and also simplifying things and not accounting for things like major setbacks to the bring up. And I mentioned multiple times that the first generation of Navi was a nightmare for the engineers at AMD. They had a lot of problems bringing it up, and supposedly, from what I recently covered in my PlayStation 5 bring-up video, some features were held back for RDNA 2. So, getting onto the revolution of chips, I am going to go out on a limb, and I don't have specific information on this, but if I had to guess, this is chiplets. Now, I remember it was Andrew Wang that previously mentioned that eventually they would be transitioning to chiplets for the GPU. But at the time, this was prior to the launch of RDNA 1, if memory serves, the interview. And I think it was with PC Games N. I'm pretty sure that PC Games N covered this. And they were stating that eventually they wanted to go for chiplets for the GPUs, but at the time they were not ready. Obviously, that was like 2019, I think the interview was. By the time RDNA 3 physically launches, it's probably going to be 2021. So I think they'll be ready by that point. And I think chiplets make sense for a plethora of reasons. The first is that, well, Nvidia are doing it as well as Intel, so obviously they need to keep up with their neighbours, so to speak. But furthermore, just from the perspective of building a more powerful GPU and to make sure that the yields are as best as possible, basically there are limitations on monolithic dies in terms of power consumption, heat output, blah, 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 blah. So going the chiplet approach makes logical sense. Sony, obviously, are also doing similar for the PlayStation future APUs. We've seen that they are going to be taking a chiplet approach there too. I will be, by the way, examining this further pretty soon, along with PS5 Pro and PS6, because a number of people have been asking me about that. I will cover it. Last few days have just been kind of crazy, to be honest with you. Most of yesterday was spent travelling, just because trains were kind of a pain in my ass. So my personal guess is that this is for a few reasons. One, I think chiplets are a shoo-in for the next generation. Two, I'm fairly certain from multiple hints, I need to be very careful how I word this, because I don't, again, want to make someone uncomfortable who's given me information, but from multiple hints, and from also multiple leaks, as well as what I'm hearing from the PlayStation 5, I'm very certain that the next generation of RDNA has improved geometry handling drastically over RDNA 2. And I'm also fairly certain that there's a much more robust caching system in place as well for RDNA 3. And I honestly would not be surprised if there are some fundamental differences on how data is handled for bringing data in from, let's say, an SSD into the GPU as well. We've kind of seen some of this previously from AMD with the Radeon Pro series, which essentially has like HBM and also an SSD pretty much bolted on. Obviously, I don't really expect it to be quite like that for the next generation of RDNA, or say next generation. But I think there will be some fundamental shifts. And honestly, from what we're hearing about Hopper, which is Nvidia's next generation. So currently we're on Turing, then it goes Ampere, and then after that will be Hopper. Hopper allegedly is also going to be MCM, so multi-chip modules. And I think honestly this is just the way that the industry is going to be evolving. It's going to be super cool. I'm really hyped. I'm really hyped. And while we're actually on the subject of Intel, Nvidia and stuff, I might as well have a very small update from Momomo on Twitter. According to what they've learned, Rocket Lake, of course, will be 8+1, which means, as we all know, 8 CPU cores plus the GPU, the iGPU. Rocket Lake, as a quick reminder, is not based on the Skylake architecture and will be a departure. It seems to be some kind of weird hybrid architecture, kind of based on, like, let's say, Willow Cove, albeit with some changes perhaps fundamentally. Either way, it's going to be DDR4 support, and Alder Lake S will be the 8+8 configuration plus 1, so of course that's the big little configuration that we've discussed 2 trillion times by now, and that will be DDR5. So that's just further confirmation that Alder Lake will be shifting to DDR5 technology, which, given the release period of Alder Lake, that, well, would be logical. And we can't have AMD and Intel without Nvidia. Well, that's what I'm going to tell myself for this video anyway, because there is a fascinating job description that has been discovered, which seems to correlate with Nvidia, yes, but perhaps also console technology and maybe an updated version of the Nintendo Switch, or perhaps Nvidia's desire to provide chips for other subsequent consoles. As we all know, the Switch is basically a very slightly modified version of the Tegra processor, albeit it's using a much older version. It doesn't even have Pascal, it's using Maxwell, and to be fair, people have squeezed quite a lot out of the Switch, but as I'm sure most of you would agree, it's not exactly a powerhouse. There's a couple of things that really hold back the Switch. One, the CPU performance, and two, bandwidth is really a big deal for the system. But there is a fascinating job advert on LinkedIn, and credit, by the way, to comicbook.com for this discovery. And essentially what they are looking for, I'm not going to read out the entire job ad. A, it's on screen, and B, I will be here until the next year reading all of this out. But essentially they are looking for someone who is a senior embedded software engineer, and it's for the Tegra Solutions engineering team. And this is going to be for a plethora of different things, including next generation graphics and AI technologies. And the key words here are for gaming consoles and AI edge devices. And it's naturally for things that you would expect, like Vulkan, OpenGL, blah, blah, blah. But they've also mentioned proprietary graphics APIs. Nintendo, like also Sony, do not use DirectX. They use their own, APIs. Microsoft, I know it sounds kind of weird, but DirectX is their proprietary API. It's literally their proprietary API for Microsoft systems. The non-proprietary would be Vulkan or OpenGL, with Vulkan and OpenGL being basically platform agnostic. So they can run on Linux, they can run on Android, obviously consoles, Windows, whatever version, and that obviously is maintained by the Kronos Group. I've actually had a couple of very interesting conversations, most recently with Neil Trevitt from Kronos. I'd encourage you to check out the interviews if you're really into graphics technology. He also works at Nvidia as well. I need to do an update, follow-up, because I believe it's like 5 months ago, something like that. I interviewed him. I can't really remember now. But anyway, they've also mentioned artificial intelligence for technology like DLSS, and I won't read out their requirements because obviously it's things like experience, like computer programming and stuff like that. But here's the thing. If this is accurate, I honestly suspect that a Switch Pro is not going to be released, over the next 6 months. This, from the way that this is being worded, it kind of sounds like the project is not being tweaked, it's still being worked on, and perhaps solutions being created. Now, essentially, to my knowledge, the Switch is very much I wouldn't say off-the-shelf component, but there is not a huge amount of customization that Nintendo did to the Switch hardware. But it's not very difficult to imagine a Switch Pro, or perhaps a just entirely different version of the Switch, like we saw with, let's say, Game Boy to 3DS or something like that. I'm speaking, by the way, in ignorance here. I just want to stress that this is not one of my sources. I'm just guessing. But if this is true, it's most likely that the Switch is probably not going to get updated for the next 1 to 2 years based upon turnaround time for silicon and projects. That's assuming that Nintendo have asked Nvidia to do this already. And obviously, this would be very cool for Nintendo because of the DLSS technology. For example, let's say that you're rendering the game at 1080p for the native screen of the Switch. That would be absolutely fantastic for a mobile device rendering at 540p, because you could basically clock the GPU way slower, or just turn off a certain number of CUDA cores, however they do it, and then basically let the tensor cores upscale. It would be astounding for a mobile device to do this. Furthermore, if you then scale this up to a, let's say, plugged in with, it's completely docked and all of that stuff, the GPU obviously can then upclock itself along with the CPU, and then you could have, let's say, 720p or 1080p with the internal resolution, and then after that it can upsample again. So with DLSS 2, it can upsample from 1080p to 4K 4 times, and 540p goes to 1080p once again 4 times. I did extensively discuss the DLSS 2 technology fairly recently in a video. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. Long story short, DLSS 2 is really interesting, and it's not hard to imagine that on a console, especially, given obviously they're optimizing around specific hardware, developers could do some crazy things. And this is kind of getting outside the remit of the video, but I did want to touch on this very briefly. Perhaps I'll go into it more extensively in the future, but one of the things that I'm thinking as well is with Nvidia apparently poised to buy ARM, the rumour is they'll announce it in the next couple of weeks. Personally, I'll wait until the announcement before I say one thing or another, but assuming it is accurate, if they do purchase ARM, it would be a very interesting selection of customization that Nintendo could offer a specific company. Further to this, I also suspect that Nvidia doing this would be very smart from the perspective of them getting involved further into the console market. I know through the grapevine, Nvidia really were under a lot of pressure to secure let's say console-specific licenses, because obviously they sell a bucket load. When you have a console and you're selling 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 million consoles, obviously as the years progress, it's a consistent revenue stream. Goodness knows that it's also very good in terms of PR as well. So we'll see. I'm not going to count the chickens until they're hatched, but I honestly would not be surprised at all if this is true. And I'd also like to spend a moment to discuss a few things that I got tagged in. One was a post on 4chan, and they are stating that indeed there will be a teardown coming by basically the end of this month, along with other things which will eventually be revealed, such as the pricing. Furthermore, there are still major third-party exclusives that Sony have secured, and apparently there is a slight hardware revision and upgrade. Honestly, my only problem with these statements is that looking at the date that they were published, it was quite recently. So it does tally up with several reports we've already seen, including several things I've stated previously. Recently I put out the PS5 bring-up video, and I mentioned in there that one of my sources had told me, well, it's kind of interesting the way he phrased it, basically. He hinted that, yes, there is possibly a upgrade in spec, but he also hinted that there was a new set of features that were in the latest PlayStation 5 development kits, although they didn't elaborate as to those features. So, if this is true, and I stress the fact if, I guess we'll know very soon. Honestly, I'm just really looking forward to a teardown and confirmation of a lot of features. As I've said many times now, the Hot Chips conference from Microsoft is also going to be mid this month too, and that's going to be amazing because Microsoft obviously have not disclosed all of the stuffs for the next gen console, so do definitely stick with me because I will be going in depth into everything that Microsoft does provide info for at Hot Chips. With all of that said though, thank you very much for watching the video. Normal stuff. Like, share, comment and subscribe, and I will see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.